Good evening, everyone. We're going to start in just a minute here. I just launched a poll that you'll see pop up. Like I said, we'll start at 8:01 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, let's slowly get the ball rolling as people continue to trickle in. We've got a lot of folks here today, so I'm going to leave time for questions and answers at the end. This presentation is being recorded, and generally that goes out to those who registered on Friday of the week of the presentation. So this Friday, you should expect that in your email inbox. My name is Tal Kitron with Appleruth Tutoring. I'm an elite level tutor and executive function coach. I'm coming to you live from Colorado, where I do all my tutoring via Zoom. And today we're just going to be talking a bit about the digital SAT, some strategies, and so on. And as I mentioned, if you have questions throughout, just put them in the Q&A and I'll answer them at the end. And without further ado, let's get started. Here's what we're planning to cover today. We're going to look at the format of the digital SAT. All SATs now are digital, so it's all computer-based. We'll talk reading and writing, so that's the first two sections, the content of those and major strategies. And then we'll also be looking at content of the math and major strategies there. Finally, we'll talk about techniques that you can immediately apply to your practice and/or official SAT. Someone mentioned the sound is echoing. I believe that's likely on your end. Let me know if other people are having that issue. Okay, not hearing much about that. So let's talk structure and scoring. 400 points just for showing up. So that's 200 for verbal, 200 for math. Of course, we don't want to score a 400. I never have seen that, but that would be just showing up and getting every answer wrong. As I mentioned, out of 800 for verbal, 800 for math. So that's one thing that over the years has stayed the same on the SAT. So as it's shifted and kind of gone from 10 sections to 4 to digital, it's always out of 1,600, aside from a few years where it was 2,400. But 1,600 is still the perfect score, the gold standard. Just add the verbal and the math and get the total. This is a section adaptive test, which we're going to talk about momentarily. Just going to test. I did have one person saying, so let me test the audio real quick. Testing. Yeah, sounds good. So I do think that if you're experiencing audio issues, it may be on your end, not mine, because others have said it sounds good, but I apologize if that's the case. So this test, we're going to kind of get into it now. This test is section adaptive, meaning that depending on how you do on this first module, reading and writing module 1, the second module will either be much harder or quite a bit easier. We want it to be harder. Section 3, math module 1, same thing. It's kind of a set form, and based on how you do, module 2 will either be much harder or much easier. And so I'll talk a bit more about what that means, because adaptive is kind of a newish thing as of the last couple of years. What it does not mean is, like on the first or third module, as you go from question to question, it's not going to like change or adapt or get harder or easier within questions or within the section. Rather, it is section adaptive. And like I said, sections 2 and 4, so verbal module 2 and math module 2, are going to vary based on how you perform on sections 1 and 3, respectively. And it's only two possibilities. Either the questions will be easier than the baseline, so either module 2 is going to be much, much harder, or it's going to be easier, easier or harder. That's it. There's no single set test form, which helps the test be more secure, as it was when it was papered. And because of that, earlier questions, so missed questions on module 1 or module 3 can affect your scores much more than later ones. And if you are finding things to be very easy on modules 2 and 4, that's usually not a great sign. We can't really control that so much, so you don't want to like panic if you see some easy questions on module 2. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're in the lower module. Generally, you'll be able to tell, but it's all about performance on those first and third sections. So starting with just general basic stuff, test is relatively short compared to what it used to be. 2 hours and 24 minutes, which includes break. Students are receiving more time to answer questions, so less emphasis on speed. Used to be there was a writing and a reading, where writing was testing grammar and punctuation and stuff like that, whereas the reading was testing comprehension, but now they're combined. And the SAT doesn't test very many grammar concepts. We'll talk about like the half dozen or so that they might test. Gone are the days of the long reading passages with 10 questions attached. They're all short, paragraph maximum 2. And one of the biggest changes is there's not a no calculator section anymore. Sections 3 and 4 for math both allow a calculator, so you can bring your own, but also we'll talk a lot about the Desmos calculator that is built into the test. Huge game changer, very big deal. And yeah, again, there used to be a whole section where you just couldn't use a calculator at all, and that is no longer. So here's the format. And what we're seeing here is two 32-minute verbal modules. And those are 27 questions apiece. So it'd be nice actually if that was the 35 minutes, because 32 minutes for 27 questions can give us a time crunch, especially on upper level verbal module 2. And then math is 35 minutes for 22 questions, mostly multiple choice, but 4 free response questions on each math section. It's a total of just over 2 hours and just under 100 questions. Another thing that as test takers, we can't really worry about or focus on during the test is the experimental questions. So whereas they used to have a full experimental section that kind of everyone knew, oh, section 5 doesn't matter, but it was for the College Board to gather data for future tests. Instead, now what they do is they put a couple questions in each section. Nobody knows which ones they are, but those would be the experimental questions that don't count. So if you see something super weird, that could be it, but you don't really want to change your strategy based on that. I think it's just good to know. This test is way, way shorter than the old SAT, which was over 3 hours long. And the ACT is changing next month into a shorter test as well. But the ACT as of like July, the last version, was also about 3 hours. So this is much, much shorter, which is great. Especially for students with extra time. Like I have many students who have dyslexia or ADHD, and if they have ADHD, well, time and a half is important. We need it, but it can be a blessing and a curse, because then you would have been there for like 4.5, 5 hours. Now, even with extended time and a half, it's still just 3.5 hours. It's not too terrible. And as mentioned, the time per question is much, much bigger. That's significantly increased on all sections. So let's talk content and strategies. I mean, I think that's the main thing I can offer as a tutor. I feel like Appleruth is on the cutting edge of the SAT changes, and now it's been this way for a few years. So we're going to talk about some of the patterns, some of the well-worn pitfalls that people encounter, and just material that you're going to see. So what you can expect on test day. So some strategies that apply throughout. First is active reading, which used to be pencil in hand always, right? Underlining, starring, circling. That's not a thing anymore. It's all on the computer, right? There's not even a Scantron bubble in. You're just filling things in on the Blue Book app. But the SAT still has a lot of reading. There's still, some math wordy problems. And then the verbal, you just really need to focus on what you're solving for. Actively engaging now means maybe highlighting. I think the answer eliminator is absolutely crucial on verbal in particular. And then that Desmos calculator that we're going to talk about a lot in the second half of today on math, we got to be able to know how to use that for both easy and trickier questions. And then don't leave anything blank. Of course, if it's a math-free response, it's hard to guess out of nowhere. But let's say you're running out of time or you don't know the answer, select, I would go straight down the line. So like pick your answer of the day. It could be C or D or A or B. But let's say you've got 5 questions left, time's running out. Instead of Christmas treeing it and going A, B, C, D, C, you'll probably miss all of those if you do that. Just go A, or C, 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 C. And then just probability wise, right? This is a good test taking strategy because you'll probably get at least one of those right, maybe more if we're lucky. And that could be a big difference, right? It could be the difference between a 690 and a 710 on verbal, for example. So there's no guessing penalty, no points off for wrong answers. There are very few standardized tests in general that have that at this point. Like ACT also, no guessing penalty. So leave nothing blank throughout. So let's talk reading and writing. We mentioned 32 minutes, 27 questions, which gives us a little over a minute per question, but not all are created equal. So like something like a vocab question where you know all the words could take 10 seconds. Same with some of the grammar. Whereas a command of evidence or a graphy-based question, those would take maybe more like 2 minutes. We don't want to take much longer than that at any point. The max you'll see per passage is 1 question associated with it. So if there's a passage that it doesn't click with you, it's not like it's going to cost us half or a quarter of the points on the section. It might cost us 1 question, but we can always just move on, come back later if we have time. So you'll see short passages, 1 question associated with each. And we'll talk about what types of questions there are. What's nice is because it's shorter and there's fewer questions, there aren't that many question types, right? It's very much finite, and we can really talk about all of them even today and look at some strategies for each. So here is what you see nowadays when you start the SAT. Everything is done via the Blue Book app, which is something you download on your computer. Those of you who have taken a PSAT, which is probably everybody since you take it sophomore year now as well, have done this before. This is the exact platform we use for SAT and PSAT. And you're going to see on the top, the clock start to click down. You can hide that, which some people do. Most of my students don't, but you can hide that if it's stressing you out, just making sure you're keeping track. The biggest things I think to point out here, so Zoom may be covering it, but in the top right, you can see the annotate button. That will allow you to highlight, so you can just select, like drag your mouse and highlight like we usually do, and then pick a color to save it as. That's probably more helpful for the longer questions. Mark for review is what we do if we want to skip a question and come back. And if you do that, you can click the black button down here at the bottom, and that'll pull up all the questions, including what you've left blank, what you've answered, and what you've marked for review in red. And then the biggest thing I think on this whole verbal section is the answer eliminator, which is right there. You pretty much always want to have that engaged. If you click it once, it's going to bring up like options here to eliminate A, B, C, D. And if you just select it, it'll just slash through the whole thing. You don't have to reselect that for every question, right? So if you engage it on question 1, it'll be up and available the whole time. Very good tool, very important on verbal. And for those of you looking along on this particular question, just if you're curious, the answer actually is B. I shouldn't have crossed it out. This is a subject-verb agreement question. Allow versus allows, we'd say they allow, it allows. And in this case, the joining, the act of joining is our subject. So it allows, even though there's a lot of words between those, the subject and the verb there. And that's one way they'll trick you. This wouldn't actually be a question 1. This would be between questions 16 and 22. And we'll talk a bit more about where things are. And that's really it. You'll go next to go to the next question, back to go back. Obviously, if it's a practice SAT, you can hit more on the top right and do save and exit if you need to take a break or just can't finish the whole test in one sitting. Here's questions 1 through 4. I'm going to write on screen a little bit more here. So on most tests, questions 1 through 4 are what we call vocab and context. The strategy for these questions is pretty simple. Step 1 is cover the answers, especially if it is a like module 2 or just a tough question, but I would always do it. Because then you're going to read the passage and predict a word, or sometimes it's a phrase, or maybe even just happy, sad, good, bad, right? If we can, predict a word or phrase that you think would work from your own mind, right? Nothing too complex. Then it's about eliminating, which is number 1 on verbal generally. We always eliminate. So which answers don't mean what we need. And then finally, it's about plugging in and just picking an answer. Sometimes that will involve looking at word roots. Sometimes it's just looking at the context and other words in the passage. Other times we just won't know all the words and we might have to guess, right? So that would be tough, but there are still strategies that can get you there if you don't know all the words. In this particular case, we want something bad. This author is frustrated. So frustrated with the something bad of existing terms, meaning not variety, not precision, because those are both happy words. And so it's one of B or D. That's how we do it, eliminate, and then plug them both in to see which one you like better. So the question is it limitations or obscurity? Well, a lot of people don't know obscurity. So you would test B, and if it works well, pick it. If you hate it and you know limitations, you know what it means, but it doesn't work, you may have to pick an answer you don't know very well, like you don't know the definition. So in that case, we could pick D, but in this case, clearly the correct answer is B, limitations. And again, every section for verbal starts with vocab. That doesn't mean you have to. Most do, but we want to be grabbing easy points and jumping around. So if you're spending a minute on a question and you don't know the words and you're not getting it, flag it for review and move on, right? It does not behoove us to spend 2-3 minutes on it, even if we get it right, honestly. Next question type we're going to look at is command of evidence. And honestly, for the next several questions, the strategy is pretty much the same. Number 1, read the question on the right-hand side. Number 2, read the passage. Number 3, eliminate answers. And number 4, pick an answer that makes you say, I can't argue with that. So not, I love it, not it's perfect, not it's sweeping and flashy and great, but it's vague and general enough that we can't argue with it. That's what we're looking for. So here our job is which quotation most effectively illustrates the claim. So we got to go to figure out what the claim is. Here it says, in the poem, The Spring, the speaker compares the changes in the season to the attitude of his beloved. So comparing nature and changes in season to a person's attitude. This question's super hard because all these quotes are very kind of 17th century. And we will see command of evidence questions with graphs as well, but I tend to think these are often harder. And so I try to eliminate any answers that maybe don't mention a person, right, or changes in a season. And I would say B and C are the 2 that fit that bill. The 2 worst answers here, because they only mention the season or the nature and not the attitude of a person. Then between A and D, I mean, they both say her, but because A is personifying the earth and it's just saying the snow is gone, it's not a great answer. D is better, even if we don't understand what it fully means, which I do not, but basically saying that his beloved is kind of icy and even the nice sunny weather can't melt that icy demeanor. So D, but the best we can really feel about that is, well, I knew it wasn't a couple. I picked the one I felt best about. I moved on. It's not like math where you can prove it correct. So I'd say this is a very hard question. And these always come between about questions 5 to about 15 or 16. And that's always the longer questions, right? So like 1 through 4 vocab, 5 through 15 long questions, but then you get to the promised land of grammar and connectors and rhetoric, which are a lot simpler, a lot quicker. So also in that 5 to 16 range, let's talk about inference questions. Give me a minute just to look at this one. So for this one, the boilerplate language on the question is which choice most logically completes the text. You'll always see that for inference. And to infer means to make like a leap of judgment, not assume anything, but kind of say, okay, because of this, I can infer, I can kind of sense that this is what's next. On the SAT, you don't really want to infer deeply. You don't want to assume too much ever. In reality, even though this is called an inference question, the answer will be in the passage. If I was highlighting, I'd focus in on words like however. Connector words, what comes after is often very crucial. And this would be a great question to skip past if you didn't love it, if you didn't understand it, or the answers were giving you trouble. You do not have to go in order on this test, right? And probably shouldn't, especially on upper level module 2. So instead, maybe this would be one we'd skip, do some grammar, come back later if we have time. And if we have to guess on this, that is not the end of the world. This one, they talk about durability and versatility in the first sentence. The correct answer is B, because it gets back to that. We can come back to this at the end if we have time, but I want to keep going here. And the main takeaway for inference is just don't assume too much or really anything. And the process is the same as it was for command of evidence, which is read the question, read the passage, eliminate. If we're not down to a couple answers at that point, you should move on, right? This might be a question we're not going to get in time. And for anyone with like perfectionist tendencies, myself included, that can be frustrating and really not intuitive to skip past anything. We're so used to just getting every question and feeling badly if we don't. But the SAT is a hunt for clues, a grab for points, just trying to grab the low-hanging fruit. So just answer as many easy questions as you can. And you want to be finishing, if we do run out of time, we want it to be on the hardest questions. Then rhetoric, this comes at the very end. So this would be 24-ish to 27. And the strategy for these is a little different. I would say definitely step 1, read the question. And that's really like almost it. I would go straight to the answers. For 4 out of 5 questions like this, at least, the bullet points are not useful or needed. So that can save you a lot of time and energy. Read the question, go straight to the answers, and then just, again, eliminate the ones that don't work. That usually gets you there. For example, here our job is the student wants to introduce the research of Aubrey and Schmidt to an audience already familiar with global warming. And then that next sentence is boilerplate language, which choice uses information from the notes to accomplish this goal. I mean, A is terrible. It doesn't mention Aubrey or Schmidt or global warming even. So A is not good. B is okay. It at least talks about what Aubrey and Schmidt are doing. So I'd keep that one. C, starts with them, which is good. They're using their expertise on how volcanic particles move around to determine if major volcanic eruptions could mitigate global warming. Looks great because it introduces their research, kind of assumes that we already know what global warming is. Got to be our answer. And then D doesn't mention the 2 scientists at all. So not good. So if you wanted to refer to the bullets and you had time to do that, we could. But I'd say the problem with B, the main problem is it doesn't introduce the research very well. And because it just says they're combating it. And it makes it seem like we don't know what global warming is, but we're supposed to be familiar. So I'd go C on this one for sure. Oops. So C is in cat, definitely the right answer. These questions, we need to get to them like before time runs out. So even though they're the last questions, make sure, absolutely sure, that you're not running out of time at the end on these questions. You want to be running out of time, if at all, in the middle on the hardest things that you've already seen and maybe skipped past. Right? Always grab the easy points first, and this would be the ones at the end are generally going to be the easier questions. And then just kind of getting into grammar a bit. So this is the main thing that people mess up and just are uncomfortable with coming into SAT prep. Well, first session will almost always, part of it will be about what's an independent versus a dependent clause. Independent meaning it can stand alone. Dependent meaning it can't. Then there's rules associated with each punctuation mark. So like if you look at the middle row here, periods and semicolons both separate two independent clauses. So because of that, they're the easiest choices to test when it comes to punctuation. You can just look at it and say, oh yeah, there's a full sentence before and after, so it's right. Or wait a second, one of these isn't independent, so it's wrong. Let me cross it out. And with one exception on this test, semicolons and periods are identical. So that's a great rule of thumb. If you see answer choice A with a period and choice C with a semicolon and nothing else has changed around them, they're both wrong because they're the same thing. In real life, are there a nuanced difference between periods and semicolons? Yes. But on the SAT, unless they're using the semicolon as like a mega comma and they're using a bunch of them in a list, we can rely on semicolons and periods being the same. What they do, periods and semicolons do, separating independent clauses, is the one thing commas cannot. So you probably heard of comma splices or run-ons. That could be just like I run, comma, I eat. That's a run-on. Two independents, only 4 words. But I run, I eat would have to be separated by a semicolon or a period. Commas are the hardest because they do a bunch of different things. So I'd like to test those generally last as compared to periods, semicolons, and colons. That's the 2 dots, which you should think of as a drum roll, please. So always must follow an independent clause, got to have a full sentence before a colon, and then it's got to introduce what comes next. Many students come in thinking colons are for lists. I would disabuse that notion completely and say on the SAT, probably not. It's just independent before introduction of something. I had one great passion in life, drum roll please, what was it? Making pizzas. For me, eating pizzas, but to each their own. So like I mentioned, I mean, this is the order to test it. There's a punctuation question right here. You can see in the answers, it's testing semicolons, periods, commas. So I'm first going to go straight to choice A and B. And we got to realize they're the same thing. Therefore, they are both wrong. We cannot have 2 right answers. So immediately we can say A and B are just gone. We can cross those out very confidently, which is great because then we won't be tempted by A, even if we don't know exactly how a semicolon is supposed to work. Now, the reason they're wrong is because the second clause after fungi, starting with producing, wouldn't be an independent. Producing more than 350 paintings and submitting her research, like, what about it? So then we just decide, can we get away with no punctuation or do we need a comma? And in this case, the answer would definitely be a comma. We need to separate 2 ideas. Can't just go straight through with no pause. Something else you can expect several of per section is connectors. So this falls under grammar. But for these, the job is just think about the ideas and do they contrast or not? So you look before, you look after, and say, are these ideas similar or contrasting? And that allows us to cross out some answers. Some notes I put here. So however and nevertheless are the same. They're both contrast words. And on the other end of the spectrum, therefore, thus, hence, consequently, those are all cause-effect words that are also the same. Here, because they're saying organisms have evolved a bunch of surprising adaptations to ensure survival, and then they mention an example of it in the tadpole shrimp embryos, the answer would have to be B, right? Because this is an example of the prior sentence. A lot of people do pretty well with these, but I will say it's an important place to shine because there's like 3 or 4 questions per section, so 7 or 8 total. And then finally, graph questions. Sometimes you'll see 3 choices that are just wrong based on the graph. They're just not true, but usually they'll all be true. And our job will be to read the passage and pick a choice that connects logically and is true in the graph. So here we'd have to read the question to figure out which choice best describes data that weaken the student's conclusion, which means we got to go to find the conclusion in the passage and then test the answers from there. These can be time consuming, they can be tough. Some people love them, some people hate them. If you know they're going to be a drain and you're going to struggle with them, or it's going to cost you confidence or momentum or time, it's another good candidate to skip, especially on Module 2 upper level. All right, so again, we'll talk about English a bit more, but we're about halfway through. I want to talk math for 15 or 20 minutes. So digital SAT math format, 35 minutes, 22 questions. This is always modules 3 and 4. That means we get about 1.5 minutes per question on average, but again, not all questions are created equal. The old SAT was more of a reading test, even for math, so lots of word problems. This newer SAT is more of a pure math test, which is better for students with English as a second language. Got a lot of international students taking SAT, and it's more, Common Core, real math now, less about trying to understand what is this problem actually saying, what are they even trying to write here. But there is still some translation of words into math that's required. And then 10–15% of the math is geometry and trigs. Don't forget they provide formulas. The big ones would be area and circumference of a circle, 3D volume on that bottom row, and then Pythagoras and special right triangles. Most people have this somewhere in their mind, but for a lot, it's been a long time. Maybe we didn't take geometry, or we took it 3 or 4 years ago or 2 years ago. So a lot of that, it's been forgotten. Of the 22 questions per section, 4 of them will be grid-ins, free response questions. Those, instead of A, B, C, D, we have to type in our answer. And there's always instructions on test day, on the left side of the page, but you want to know going in what to do so you don't waste time reading those. You can put in anything from 0 to 9, fraction symbol, which is a slash, a decimal point, or a negative, but that's it. No square root or exponents or anything like that. Up to 5 characters for a positive answer and 6 for negative, which includes the negative sign. And then stuff like if your answer is 3.5, enter it as 3.5 or 7/2, not 3(1)/2, because that would be 31/2. And then in the rare situation that your decimal doesn't fit, don't round, stop it when you run out of room to type. So do not round on your own volition. I think fractions, if you can get it to a fraction, is probably better, safer. But if my answer is 3.55555, I want to type in 3.555 until I run out of room. And here's what they provide on test day. So just leave this up for a moment for people to see. So it would be a shame, right, if we knew our answer was 2/3 and we typed in 0.66 or 0.67, because we're technically right, but they would not give you the points. Here's what the math section looks like. So you get verbal modules 1 and 2, you get a 10-minute break, and then we start back up with math. You see mark for review, you see the clock on top, you see ABC. The number one thing here by far is the calculator, right? Reference sheet's right next to it, so that's good for geometry, knowing it's there. But that calculator is like an absolute gift, cheat code in a lot of circumstances. Most students, even who are Desmos experts, don't realize just how much it can do for you. For example, like for this question, equivalent is a kind of blinking red light that says Desmos is an option. We could literally plug in x squared plus 5x minus 50 into the calculator and then test the answers till we got the one that looked exactly the same. Many of us wouldn't need to do that. We could factor, we could FOIL, we could just see it, but that option would make it no chance of a careless error, pretty efficient. We can prove it correct. So I'm a big proponent of using that graphing calculator even on simple questions. It makes me as a tutor feel fraudulent sometimes because it's like, I want to teach the math here, but honestly, the best, quickest, smartest way to do it is just use the graphing calculator. Here's what that looks like. So if you click the calculator, you get that image on the left, kind of smaller. And if you hit expand on the top of that, it looks bigger. The only kind of annoying part is that covers part of the question and answers. So it's a lot of kind of moving it around. So a lot of people stick with the smaller version. And then you can just type stuff in, right? Like if I wanted to know 15% of 70, I would literally type in 15%, and then it would give me the of, and I put 70. There's things in the keyboard that you can see there, you can open up. And then functions is where you find some of the more obscure stuff, like nth root or trigonometry. As I mentioned, it's a game changer. We open and close it just by clicking. It can remain open the whole time. Some people minimize or click out of it. Some people just leave it open. You should bring your own calculator. So you've got like a TI-84 or whatever, TI Inspire, like those are pretty much all legal on the SAT. I respect that choice, and I think bringing it is smart, but that Desmos option, once you get used to it, so convenient, so helpful, kind of necessary to do really great on the SAT math. But there's a few things that maybe I use my own calculator for, like degree. If I'm in degree mode, Desmos is defaults to radians. So I might use my calculator for degrees, like sine, cosine, tangent. But like Desmos can give you a decimal into a fraction or vice versa. And it can just graph parabolas like you see up there. So you can find x-intercepts, vertex, and so on. So yeah, this is probably, if there was one thing I'd recommend beyond grammar rules, like punctuation stuff, the other thing I would say before you take an SAT, practice with Desmos, make sure you really know how to use it to full advantage. Some stuff we can do, and we're going to look at a few practice questions that will kind of, I'll show you how we do it. But if you have a system of equations and they want a solution, well, that means where do they intersect? So just plug them in and click on the point of intersection. That way we're not doing isolating and substituting or elimination. We don't risk flipping a negative sign or solving for x instead of y as much. We literally just graph it, click on the point, and bubble in our answer. I would say of the 22 questions per section, at least 10 are Desmos focused, and sometimes up to like 15 or so. So there's times when you can do almost a whole math section without really doing any math on your own, just knowing how to use Desmos properly. I'll leave this up for a bit because I think it's important. Take a look at what this SAT tests. Used to be kind of a lot of statistics, probability, mean, median, mode, scatter plots, line of best fit. That went down from 28% to 15%. Geometry and trig actually went up a little bit, but the vast majority of the math in this test is algebra. 70%, because algebra, of course, is that, but advanced math is just like algebra 2. And that would be the class I think you should have taken before you take an SAT, is you want to have completed algebra 2 to really kind of have all the knowledge you need. And then the stats and trig stuff and geometry isn't super advanced, but there'll be like 3D geometry questions or things that seem unit circle-y that are pretty tough. There's usually a way around it, but I would say those are what give a lot of my students the most trouble. But 70%, I mean, that's incredibly algebra heavy, which is good because it's often what we've done most recently in school. And pre-calc, can help a little bit, but generally anything beyond that is just going to muddle things and people will be working too hard. So yeah, you can see up from like 60% to now at least 70% algebra. Overall strategy for every single math problem. Number one, read the question to determine what you're solving for. I used to say circle it, but now it might be highlight or just make sure. Write it in your scratch paper, which still is provided for both verbal and math, by the way. Plan your attack, right? So am I supposed to just put this in Desmos? Do I need to create an equation or two equations or something different? Third step, of course, is to calculate without skipping steps, writing everything down as every math teacher ever, I'm sure, has told you. And then even though it's a time crunch, sometimes you want to double check, like just a quick logic check, right? Did I answer what the question asked? Does it make sense for this to be negative or positive? Did I solve for Y when I was supposed to solve for X, and so on? Right, so very straightforward, just like taking your time when you can and being very careful to not skip steps, basically. Because you're looking at something and just saying, oh, I know what this is. You may be right, but at the same time, if it's that quick, there's a big risk of a careless mistake. I included this because I think people sometimes overcorrect after learning about Desmos and just want to put everything in, which often works, but there are certain questions that have too many variables, or there's a shortcut if you just did the math. And so I want everyone to have this checklist in mind. It's the basic algebra of isolating a variable, right? Combining terms. So, 3x plus 4x is 7x. Factoring and foiling, which we almost never have to do thanks to Desmos. But then with simple math like distributing, substituting, right? Often we're plugging in points or something in for x. If, however, you've gone through that checklist and none of those really work or seem right, try using the answers, look at those four choices and use those to full advantage, or maybe picking numbers to plug in if there's a bunch of variables, right? Or percent, often I start with 100 and just kind of work from that because that's an easy number to work with for percent. And then just for the millionth time, and I'll mention it more, definitely do not forget about Desmos. It may not be like your first go-to, but like I said, it'll answer at least half the questions if you know how to use it correctly. So I mentioned working backwards with answers. If you look at something like this inequality question and you didn't feel like just solving it out or you weren't sure, you don't remember, try it with the answers, working backwards and just plugging in to see which one here is not a solution, right? So you just plug -9 in and see if that's a true statement or not. This at this point, though, is a question we could also just plug it straight into Desmos. Inequalities, they do a great job of. And then you can just see which of these answers falls into the shaded region and which one of the four doesn't. All that being said, I think this question is one that most people would just treat like a regular equation. Subtract 2x from both sides, subtract 3, and you get x is greater than or equal to -8, which is true for all answers except for A. -9 is not greater than or equal to -8. And this is a very, very common question type, exponential modeling. They're saying here the number of virions grown in a cell culture doubles every 12 hours. Do I know what virions are? I do not. Doesn't matter. There are 100,000 of them in the cells at the start of an observation, which represents the number of virions V in the cell T days after the start of observation. So the way picking numbers would work here is not intuitive, but important. So if it's doubling every 12 hours, that means that in one day, if T is 1, it should be doubling twice, right? T is days. In one day, that's 24 hours, the number should double 2 times. A and B are saying we start with 2 and it goes up by a factor of 100,000. So these are bad answers. C and D both have 100,000 as an initial amount. But if I plug in 1 there, that means that it's not going to give you a doubling because the exponent would be 1/12. We'd have to have 12 days to double. So that is saying it doubles every 300 hours, every 12 days. Whereas this one is saying when you put in t as 1 day, it'll double twice. And that is what they've kind of set up here. So ideally, we get to the point where we really understand the exponential modeling setup. But even if not, you can still get this by picking numbers. I'm just going to look at content areas and a few example problems. We won't do these, just going to show you what they look like, because I think it's more important to do the Desmos questions that I have up here. But I will leave each of these slides open for a little bit. So first is the basic algebra. 35% of the test. Got to know y equals mx plus b, right? So just linear equations. Got to also know that y is f of x, which most people I think are quite comfortable with. Systems of two equations, which is always Desmos. You just graph it and find the intersection point. And then we've already seen an inequality, but those also fall under basic algebra. So it's really equation of a line stuff for the most part. Y-intercept, slope, stuff that people haven't done in a while, so it's rusty, but it's fairly simple, and everyone remembers mx plus b and how to find slope after a little bit of review. And of the 44 questions, like 13 to 15 of them are going to be this stuff. Alarmingly simple on a lot of occasions. Examples would include stuff like this, where you've got how many solutions. In other words, how many times do these two lines intersect? That's Desmos City. And then the one on the right, they give you an equation and want to know what is the interpretation of y, right? So you'd have to just look, does that relate to the 1,200 acre industrial? No, it relates to 1,800 acre residence. And then we'd have to pick between B and D with a little bit of just plugging in and logic. We'll come back to this if we have time. Second major content area that's also about 35% of the test is the advanced math, which is also algebra. This stuff does comprise a lot of the hardest questions. So we saw one with equivalent, meaning which of these two are identical, even if they're in different forms. Exponents and roots rules, which a lot of people are rusty with. And then the biggest part of this is parabolas. So quadratics, x-intercepts, vertex. We also see exponential growth and decay, absolute value, which is straight to Desmos. And then, as I mentioned, roots and rational equations. That doesn't come up as often, but stuff like that maybe relates to quadratic formula, which is worth memorizing if you haven't already. Again, this is more algebra 2. Most people have learned this stuff more recently, so in a way it's easier, but it's also more advanced math. So you need to know about like how to shift a graph on Desmos and what certain forms represent. Two examples. Here, the first one is just saying isolate 3k minus 2. So it'd just be a couple steps. And the second one is more of a physicsy type question, which is just interpreting an equation and then saying here which value represents the initial height. So graphing that on Desmos can give you like kind of an obvious answer. You also maybe could know, well, that means when we dropped it, t is 0. 0 seconds have passed. If you plug in 0 for t, you get 600. So some of these questions are very advanced and some of them in reality are not, if you know what they're asking. And then two more content areas and then a few practice questions, and we'll open it up for Q&A. 20%, I mean, I think it's less than that. I should probably change this to more like 10, 15%. But data analysis includes ratios and proportions, some dimensional analysis, unit conversion, percents, which are, for my money, some of the hardest stuff they could test. Need to know mean versus median. Also, how to do line of best fit. Every once in a while, they do like modeling equations. Probability, a few per test, and then samples and inferences. So stuff like margin of error. It's all very simple, but a lot of people have not learned it or haven't learned it well. Two examples. You can see the left is a percentage one. The right is about comparing means, which, like, I'm a broken record, but you can use Desmos to find mean and median. You literally type the word mean and put the numbers in parentheses with commas between. It'll just spit out the average. So both of these questions, to be honest, you could do very easily on Desmos. If you don't know what I mean by that, that would be a point of emphasis as you prepare for the SAT. And then last and kind of least is geometry and trig. Stuff like right triangles and other triangles, knowing that they give you the reference sheet for area and volume formulas. Right triangles, so Pythagoras, but also special right triangles, which they provide, and SOHCAHTOA, that's sine, cosine, tangent. If they don't give you a shape, you must draw it and mark it up. So on your scratch paper, you draw that shape out, and then just refer back to that reference sheet as needed. Here's a couple examples of those. On the left, we see basically a Pythagorean theorem and then simplifying question. On the right, we see alternate interior, alternate exterior degrees questions. So again, some people really love geometry, had a great teacher, and are fond of this stuff, and it's no sweat. Many of my other students really don't love it, and they feel kind of lost at sea with some of it until you review the rules and practice. Right, and repetition really is the name of the game. Repetition, review, time drills, practice tests, right? That's how you get good at this test. SAT really is a tested effort. So last item of business is, let's just kind of look a bit more at how to use Desmos. Here's the first one. Two equations, both linear. I used to have to say, well, let's isolate and substitute. Or maybe we can eliminate and solve that way, eliminate X or Y. But now you're going to take these two equations, you're going to put them straight into Desmos as expression 1 and 2, and you're going to click on where they cross, because that is solution to a system, is their intersection point. And boom, I mean, it's there. I just need to know if I'm solving for X or Y. They said Y. The answer is 3. Easy as it gets. Only risk we run is solving for X instead of Y, or typing it in the wrong way, which is a risk. That was basic algebra. Here's a quadratic, which is in this case, upward opening parabola. It's saying it has zeros at points A and B. What is the length of that segment? Well, I don't need to agonize over this or draw out the graph. I'm going to type in it exactly as it is. Click on the two x-intercepts, the two solutions, aka zeros or roots. And I mean, they're 6.5 apart. Our answer is 6.5. Graph it, click on those 2 points, and just look at how far they are apart from each other. Easy. And then finally, functions. So here, the table on Desmos, it's again a cheat code. You got a cubic polynomial here, which is interesting. And they just want to know which of these answers with x, y points fits this graph. So like, again, type table, literally type the word table into the first expression. It'll create a table for you. And then actually what will happen is this will pop up as a little regression. It'll graph it for you. If you click this little button here, after just entering a few points, you can then drop down whether it's linear, quadratic, exponential, and it'll legitimately give you the equation. So like, play with that, make sure you know how to use it. That is the ultimate cheat code on this test. And then systems of inequalities, we'll skip this one for now because I want to leave time for questions. To recap for math, make sure you know what you're solving for. Answer that and not anything else. Sometimes a simple word like the word by or a preposition can change the question. So pay attention to detail. No guessing penalty, so leave nothing blank. Do not have to go in order, so skip around to grab the easiest points and mark for review as needed. And then don't forget to use Desmos in the given formulas. There's usually a simple method of solving. The way to practice for the SAT, obviously like tutoring is a great resource, but if you're doing it individually, Appleruth does have 4 good SAT mocks, which provide really detailed score reports that you can go over with a tutor or on your own. Blue Book, the app, also has 7 digital SATs. Those are probably the best source for practice because they're the most like the real test. And they've also got a couple PSATs as well. So, I mean, practice tests and reviewing those, like looking at questions you missed, that's the way to learn. And as I mentioned, this is a test of effort, not intelligence. So test scores don't define you, you just do what you can. I'm going to launch one more quick poll, and then we've got a few minutes for questions. This is kind of the cornerstones of Appleruth's prep is test prep, which is mostly what I do. I also do some executive function coaching. And then if your student needs help or you need help with a certain topic like APUSH or some course in school, we also have plenty of great tutors who do that. I do all of mine online. I live in Colorado, so most of my students are like in Seattle or Atlanta or even overseas. So it's just all done via Zoom. But yeah, you can reach out to info@appleruth.com about that or call this number. And if you feel like you've gotten what you need, we just got a few minutes here for questions, but feel free to call it a night. Thank you for joining. And now I'm just going to open it up for questions. Got a bunch of people here, so I'm sure we'll have some good ones. The first is asking if I can list the steps for vocab and context again. Absolutely. Step 1 is cover the choices because you don't want to give yourself a bias of like, oh, I think it's going to be this word. I know this word and it works. A lot of times that leads us astray. So block them out and then predict your own word if you can. If you can't, just is it positive or negative, right, or a phrase. Then you eliminate, which is number 1 thing to do on verbal generally. And then we plug in and choose. That can involve word roots, right, a little bit of analysis. But if you're thinking too hard about that, it may just be a question that we're not gonna solve in the right amount of time. Next question is, said for grammar, periods and semicolons are the same with an exception. And yeah, I did kind of briefly mention that. The exception to that is if you have a list, so I bought milk, cereal, and I don't know, raspberries. That is not how I usually write, but every once in a while, if you see a bunch of semicolons in place, then we want to be parallel to that structure and pick an answer with a semicolon. So in reality, I'd use commas, but on the SAT, if you see a bunch of semicolons as a mega comma separating items in a list, that is the one time they are not the same as periods. So semicolons are usually our periods, but this on the left, this example would be different. Yeah, good questions. Next one is, how many questions are vocab based on average? 4 per section, so 8 total. So vocab review is definitely a thing that helps now. Another one is, what does one solution, infinite solutions, and no solutions mean? It depends on if we're dealing with a parabola or lines. If it is 2 lines, no solution means they're parallel. Infinite means they're the same dang line, because that would mean same y-intercept and same slope. And then one solution would be any 2 lines with different slopes. Those intersect one time. However, if you're dealing with a parabola or polynomial, no solutions would mean we don't intersect the x-axis. One solution would mean we hit it 1 time, so on the vertex, and 2 solutions would mean 2 x-intercepts. Infinite wouldn't come into play for a parabola. And the solutions thing, I mean, that is definitely something to work on. It's a good question. I would say definitely something that you want to review. One question here is, could you show us again how to use Desmos tables? Yeah, I mean, it's crazy, but it's literally typing the word table. So I'll just leave that slide up for a minute. Got time for just a couple more. Some are about scores, but again, we're at 7, so I'm going to give us just 2 more minutes. 7 Mountain Time, that is. One question is, if we have an answer like 0.35555, we should enter that as an answer. Should we not round to 0.3556? The answer is actually that both are acceptable, but I would refrain from rounding ever. So I would enter in 0.35555 and not round the last number. Yeah, good question. Okay, last couple questions here is scores. So what's a good score? Or what would I have to do to achieve a 1500? That's impossible to answer. I would love to, but the reality is good score depends on where you're starting and what your goals are. So no such thing as a good score because you can always improve it. Most people want to be like above 1,000 to start, but it really depends on where you're at. And then to achieve a 1500 or above, it's same. It's like, where are we starting? Right? If you're starting at a 1400, that's very much doable. If we start at an 1100, there aren't many people that get to 1500. Right? It's possible, but you'd really have to go every question and really review it with a fine-tooth comb. And one last one, which is, if you finish a reading question quicker than normal, do you get to use that extra time on another reading section or on a math section? Time does not carry over from section to section. So on section 1, if you go quickly through a question, that's great, but it's just giving you more time for other questions on that particular section, right? It is not like carrying over. You don't get to add time to section 2 or to the math, unfortunately. All right, thank you guys so much. Sorry I couldn't get to all the questions. Hope it was helpful, and good luck on SAT in the future, and enjoy the rest of your evening.